Greetings from Mrs. Shapiro. So I'm going to show you how to get rid of fractions in an equation so you don't have to deal with them. All right? And whether there's one fraction or two fractions, we're going to do basically the same thing. So when we look at this, we have one denominator, it's a 5. So what we're going to do is multiply everything by 5. So that means we have to multiply. So technically we would be doing this. Multiplying both sides by 5. Okay. The other way we might do this is, I'm going to go back to the original equation. This way I think is a little easier to follow. If we just multiply each piece by 5, right, we just distribute that 5. Okay, so 5 times x is 5x. Bring down the minus. 5 times 1 over 5, these 5's cancel, and we just get a 1. And then 1 times 5 is 5, and now we have this simple, and by simple I mean no fractions in it, equation to work out, and you would go ahead and finish solving this. Get x by itself, so add a 1 to both sides, so you'd have 5x equals 6, right, because these guys cancel out just like you wanted them to, and then divide both sides by 5, and you get x equals 6 over 5. And just leave it that way. You don't need to change to a mixed number. In algebra, it's easier to work with a fraction, or later on we'll change them to decimals when we're in real-world problems. Okay, so let's look at this next one. There are two variables here. So I'm going to rewrite this with a little room in it. Okay, and then what's our common denominator for 10 and 5? What that means is, what is the number that 5 and 10 would both divide into evenly? What's the smallest number? And that would be 10. Right? 5 goes into 10, 10 goes into 10. So 10's the common denominator, so we're going to multiply each piece by 10. I'll write 10 over 1 by the fraction. Okay. And then as we go through this, the 10's cancel, and we have 7 over 1, which is just 7. We have 10 times v, which is just 10v, minus 5 goes into 10 2 times, 4 times 2 is 8. And now we have this equation to solve. We want to get 10v by itself. We would end at 8 to both sides. So we have 15 equals 10v. V is multiplied by 10. So we would divide by 10. And we would just get v equals 15 over 10. You should always try and reduce it. So what number goes into both 5 and 10? That's 5. So 5 goes into 15 3 times. 5 goes into 10 twice. So we get v is equal to 3 over 2. Okay. When there's fractions in the equation, you don't always get a fraction for an answer, but sometimes you do. All right, let's look at this next one. I have the same denominator, so that makes it easy to figure out what the common denominator is. It's just going to be a 5. So I'm going to rewrite this equation and just leave some room, to multiply everything by 5. And then as I go through this, The 5's cancel. I have a negative 16 over 1, which is just a negative 16. R times 5 is 5R. When I do this multiplying here, the 5's cancel, so I end up with 8 over 1. I bring down my minus sign. 8 over 1 is 8. And now I go ahead and solve this equation. I want R by itself, so I add an 8 to both sides. A negative 16 plus 8 is a negative 8. Use your calculator if you need to. This cancels just like I wanted it to. R is multiplied by 5, so I'm going to divide by 5, and I get this, negative 8 over 5. And you can just leave it that way. You don't need to make it a mixed number. If you want to change it to a decimal, that would be fine. And then we always, I'm running out of room here, we always write our variable first. And when you write this negative 8 over 5, the negative can go in the numerator, or the negative can go out in front. Okay. I think it's easier to keep track of if you write it in the numerator, but either way, equally correct. All right, let's look at another problem. There are two denominators here, so we have to think about what's the common denominator. What do 20 and 5 both divide into? What's the smallest number they both divide into? And that number is 20. It has to be at least as big as the biggest number. Okay? We're not looking for what's a common factor here. The common factor would be 5. For 5 and 20. We're looking for, if we change them to a common denominator, what would that common denominator be? All right, so we're going to multiply each part by 20. All right, the 20s cancel, and we have 23 over 1, or just a 23. Bring down the equal sign. 20 times x is just 20x. And then when we work on this last little part here, we have a minus sign, so let's bring that down. 5 goes into 24 times. 3 times 4 is 12. Equation, no fractions. And then we would go ahead and solve this. We want to get the x's by themselves like this, so we need to add a 12 to both sides. So we get 35 equals 20x. Divide both sides by 20, and we get 35 over 20 is equal to x. And then you should reduce that fraction. What number divides into both 35 and 20? That's 5. So 5 goes into 35 7 times. 5 goes into 20 4 times. And we just leave it with that fraction. Okay? When there's only one fraction, that's easy. You're just going to multiply everything by that denominator. All right, one fraction, it's one denominator, it's 3. You would just multiply everything by 3. So these 3's would cancel. You'd have negative 10, 3 times x, and bring down the minus, and 2 times 3 is 6, and then go ahead and solve that. All right.